Okay, I put it live. We can.
Pardon?
It's live now.
Okay.
It's live?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And if you wish, you can take your masks off to deliver the press conference, because otherwise it'll be hard to hear.
Yeah.
Are we ready to go? Start?
Go ahead.
Great. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I am Brian O'Donnell. I'm the Director of Campaign for Nature, and I'll be moderating today's press event. First, I'd like to briefly introduce our four speakers that we'll be having, myself included. One of our speakers, Walter Jetz, who will be joining via Zoom, is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and of forestry and environmental studies at Yale University in the United States. He's joining us, as I said, on Zoom. And then we'll have Valerie Courtois, who is a director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. She'll also be joining via Zoom. And KM Reyes, who's here in person with us in Geneva. KM is the co-director and co-founder of the Center for Sustainability Studies, Center for Sustainability in the Philippines. We'll have time for questions at the end of the brief remarks. So if you have a question, please introduce yourself and your outlet and whom you are addressing your question to. Let me start by saying that we are excited to be here in Geneva and to see negotiations resuming for the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 framework. During a time of wars, a pandemic, the biodiversity and climate crises, the world is in desperate need of good news, and we are hoping that this negotiating session will provide some of that hope and positive leadership that the world so desperately needs. In terms of the issues that we're looking forward to in the coming days and weeks, an absolute must-have in terms of the negotiations is a target to safeguard at least 30% of the world's lands, freshwaters, and oceans. This is the most widely supported target in the framework. More than 90 countries are now members of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, a coalition of governments that back this target. And I want to make clear that this is a global target, not a target that every country can or is expected to meet individually, but as a global community, we need to reach this target. Without a target of that scale that addresses habitat loss at its core, we don't believe that the framework will be a success. So we think this is a key moment. We're excited to see it in the draft and hoping the negotiations continue to show this wide support for the target. Walter will discuss briefly in a few moments the science behind area-based conservation targets. It's also important to make clear that this target is done in a rights-based manner that respects the leadership of Indigenous peoples and local communities who have been among the best stewards of nature globally and whose territories house most of the world's concentrations of biodiversity. We at Campaign for Nature are advocating that the target include specific language for prior, and informed consent, so that it's added to ensure that a rights-based approach to conservation is enshrined within the area-based conservation target. And both Val and KM will talk about that as well. And one crucial component for the negotiations will be finance. We know that if we're going to have large-scale conservation, restoration, address issues of pollution, invasive species, these are going to cost additional resources. And we can't get there without closing the massively large biodiversity finance gap. In order to close that gap, one of the most important things we can do is reform subsidies. Currently, the world spends billions and billions of dollars on subsidies that are harmful to nature, subsidies that prop up the fossil fuel industry, that promote unsustainable industrial scale agriculture and fishing. And those are issues that need to be reformed, and those resources should be allocated instead towards the conservation of nature. We also know that wealthy nations, those that have an outsized impact on biodiversity loss through the high levels of consumption and resource use, have an extra responsibility in providing more resources for the conservation of biodiversity. We believe that much of this resource, as academics have shown, about 30% of the impact of biodiversity loss in the developing world can be traced back to international trade. So we think that same amount of percentage of resources should go into sustainable finance for the conservation of nature. We are calling for $60 billion as a target for wealthy nations to provide developing nations as a resource mobilization target in the form of grants to make sure that these resources are provided without strings attached and to make sure that no new debts are incurred. That'll be a critical component that we'll watch for in the coming weeks. So with that, I'm going to start to talk a little bit more, or turn it over to Walter, who will talk more about the science behind area-based conservation. As I mentioned, Walter is a professor at Yale University and has written extensively about biodiversity, habitat, and species. So Walter, can you hear us and start your remarks?
Hi there, yeah, I can hear you, and thank you for having me. And yeah, let me add a bit from the science corner. I contributed to the IPBES report, was part of the task force on knowledge and data there, and thus got quite intimately familiar with the various and quite concerning evidence that has been accumulating about species extinctions, but also solutions that can help. So first of all, and you all know, we are facing an extinction crisis. We have been losing species at an unprecedented rate, an accelerating rate over the last decades. And with that, we are losing species with cultural values, species of immense aesthetic value, species of economic value, species that have important functions in the larger ecosystems, and that compound set of species that is facing this extinction crisis right now is really an important part of what makes our planet function and work. They deliver important functions and services ultimately to people. And I guess the one good news here is that we know also from sufficient evidence that there are solutions to address this crisis. And while species extinctions can have many causes, the one predominant cause is that of habitat loss. So changes, encroachments to terrestrial habitats or disturbances in marine habitats, coastal habitats. And these encroachments or exploitations, they really are very, very readily managed in many cases, and that is where the solution is sitting. So as part of the CBD post-2020 framework, we do need strong targets to conserve biodiversity via the safeguarding of habitats. It's a really powerful way to prevent the further extinction, to minimize the extinction of species, to forever lose species and forever lose the values that they hold. There is excellent scientific evidence that any addition of protected areas or other effective conservation measures provides additional important support for the conservation of biodiversity. There is strong evidence for a minimum of 30% of the world's lands and oceans and freshwaters, if possible, to be safeguarded as a minimum target for so we can address the extinction crisis. So we need these targets. We need the 30% target. We should strive for more. We should have an ambition of ultimately up to half of the planet. I'm also advising the E. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation as a scientific advisor, and ultimately we should aim for more. But as a 20 by 30 target, 30 by 30 approach is the way to go, and there is excellent scientific evidence that it indeed delivers important outcomes. So we need that large coverage of areas, but we should also be smart about where these areas are. We need to ensure that biodiversity outcomes arise, and there is also really excellent scientific progress now in measuring that progress, to measure these outcomes and to provide guidance, decision support as countries, as agencies, as stakeholders consider various places for different management options. So thanks to remote sensing, modeling, as well as a local engagement with information, sort of a science policy collaboration, there is really tremendous opportunities now to support local decision makers so that biodiversity outcomes can be achieved as protected areas or other effective measures are being considered. And there are really excellent indicators to do that. There is a species protection index, for example, that provides very direct measurements and guidance for achieving biodiversity outcomes as part of a 30 by 30 target. So this is not a time for small measures. Nature does need us to be ambitious in this framework. There is abundant scientific evidence that a 30 by 30 target is needed now to stop the extinction crisis. And with that, I'd like to hand back to the organizers.
Thank you very much, Walter. Our next speaker, I think we're just making sure she was able to join. I know she was having some technical difficulty, is Valerie Courtois from the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. I don't know if Valerie was able to join us on Zoom.
Hi, Valerie.
I'm here, Brian.
You are, perfect, excellent. Val has been a leader on the conservation of nature in Canada, where significant progress has been made with Indigenous guardian programs, new Indigenous protected areas. So I'm going to turn it over to Val to talk about some of the experiences that she has helped lead in that region. Go ahead, Val.
Thanks so much, Brian, and hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Courtois. I'm the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which is a nationally focused network of Indigenous leaders here in what is now known as Canada. For us, the opportunity to participate in the conservation kind of landscape is really one that we've been looking for a very long time to do. And in fact, in Canada, the efforts of achieving those targets has really created a context where we can talk about the relationship that we have with the state of Canada. And in fact, in many ways, we can achieve our what we're calling reconciliation goals at the same time of achieving those goals around conservation. And of course, you know, our very identity, everything that we are as peoples depends on our landscapes and waterscapes. And so we are very much in line with doing that. In fact, the opportunity for achieving the targets has led to Canada making significant investments in Indigenous-led conservation. The most recent of which is $340 million, that was announced last July, of which almost half is dedicated towards Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and the other half towards Indigenous-led stewardship through guardian programs. The vast majority of new protected areas that are being established and have been established in the last 20 years in Canada have been Indigenous-led or co-led here in this country, and we have a number of great examples of that, where that is one of the newest national parks in Haida-Nanene on the east arm of Great Slave Lake, or some significant national wildlife areas in Idéji and Tuyata in the Northwest Territories. But there are a number of new proposed IPCAs that are just being brought online. And in fact, those new IPCAs represent a significant portion of the target to be achieved in Canada. And we are anxious and keen to work with the Canadian government in seeing more of these targets achieved here. Of course, always in the optic of recognition of our rights and titles as Indigenous peoples and as Indigenous nations. And so with that, Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Valerie. That was excellent to hear about the progress that you have been making. We'll now turn over to KM Reyes. Again, KM is the co-executive director and co-founder of the Center for Sustainability in the Philippines. KM.
Hi everyone, so I'm KM. It's great to hear what Valerie was saying because our experience is also quite similar in the Philippines. I'm the co-founder of the Center for Sustainability PH, and we are an Indigenous-led youth group. Our mission is to protect the Philippines' last remaining 3% of pristine rainforest through the legal establishment of protected areas. So the week before Christmas last year, my island Palawan in the Philippines was wiped out by Super Typhoon Odette. Many of my friends, family, and colleagues lost our homes and our possessions, but by stroke of miracle, not our lives. This time. Except it wasn't a miracle. Rather, Palawan, known as the Philippines' last biodiversity frontier, still retains half its forest cover. And this absorbed the hit of devastating winds at 260 kilometers per hour. So holding the line at our forest front lines, our bioshield from the climate and biodiversity crises goes far beyond negotiations. It is a daily and practical imperative to survive on my island. So for these negotiations in Geneva to bear any impact for frontline conservationists like myself, we need a robust post-2020 global biodiversity framework. What does this mean? The framework must expand conservation to follow the science and ensure a target of a minimum of protecting 30% of global land and waters by 2030, explicitly respecting the free and prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and ensure the framework commits to directly funding IPLCs to lead biodiversity protection. Not only are IPLCs the best conservationists of biodiversity, but we are also the most cost-effective. Currently, 91% of Indigenous lands, representing 32% of global lands, remain in good to moderate ecological condition, and Indigenous peoples protect a whopping 85% of global biodiversity. However, IPLC groups spend a fraction, between 16 and 23%, the budget that global conservation institutions do on land conservation while delivering the same outcomes. Case study. In Palawan, our Indigenous-led youth group, the Center for Sustainability PH, protects a swath of pristine rainforest 26 times the size of the city of Geneva. This forest is the ancestral domain of the disappearing Batak tribe, who've safeguarded this area since time immemorial, and boasts 31 IUCN globally threatened species, 61 endemic species, including the #1 poached animal globally, the pangolin. And we protect this critical habitat with daily patrols by Indigenous rangers at a mere cost of $20,000 per year, much cheaper than a Rolex. Across Southeast Asia, more widely, we face very singular issues. We are home to 20% of the world's terrestrial fauna and flora and marine life, and are one of only 3 major biodiversity and tropical landscapes, with the South American Amazon and the African Congo. However, we are far more densely populated, home to 800 million people, more than the Amazon and Congo combined. 3 of the 17 mega biodiverse countries are located in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, as are 3 of the most consistently vulnerable countries on the planet to extreme climate events since 1999, also including the Philippines. And current trends indicate we are only going to become even worse impacted with each new year. So it's no wonder that citizens in our region agree with scientists. And in a recent poll in Southeast Asia, almost all respondents, between 95 to 98%, supported the global goal to protect 30 by 30. And between 85 to 94% want our respective governments to support the global target here at the CBD. The time is ripe. We must act now. I deserve Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you, KM. We'll now turn to questions, and as a reminder, if you could state who you'd like to direct your question to. As a reminder, the speaker's name's Walter. Walter Jetz was our scientist from Yale University. Valerie Courtois was with the Indigenous Leadership Initiative in Canada, and you just heard from KM Rays. So we'll now see if we have any questions either online or in the room.
Yeah, Fritz Abakus of German weekly Die Zeit. I wondered to KM and also to Valerie whether you see that governments are seeking your opinion and whether the public debate has shaped. And because my feeling is that the topic of bringing Indigenous perspective into the picture is becoming bigger on the global agenda, but I wonder whether that's also something that you see on the ground. We heard it a bit from you, Valerie, but
Do you want to start? Val, were you able to hear that question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why don't you start, and then we'll take it to KM after you conclude.
Thanks for that question. Indeed, the Canadian government is asking our perspective. Now, let's not kid ourselves. We've gone a long way into creating the legislative framework to them being required to consult Indigenous peoples about activities on their lands and in their waters. But that being said, you know, this Canada as a country is really coming to a reckoning and thinking about its colonial history and what sort of future it wants to design for itself. And that includes what sort of healthy environment Canada could contribute, both to our own kind of populations, but also globally. And so very much our perspective is being considered. And in fact, our Prime Minister has recognized that the only way that Canada is going to achieve its contribution to the global target is by enabling Indigenous leadership in conservation and stewardship. So this is indeed, from my perspective, a real opportunity to do things right. Now, keeping in mind that Canada is in its entirety Indigenous. The country of Canada was built upon 51 First Nations, 634 communities, 51 Inuit communities, 4 Inuit regions, and countless Métis nations and communities. And so it's really important for Canada to move forward to do that in a rights and title-based context. But we are achieving that. We just did our recent counting as a country, and there has indeed been increases in the last few years of protected areas, percentages, and those have been almost entirely contributions by Indigenous peoples, and we're anxious to see more. In fact, we've got proposals that are on the books now. One proposal alone is 55,000 square kilometers in size. I think that's the size of a small European country, if I'm not mistaken. So those are going to be significant contributions. Another example is a First Nations in the Northwest Territories that is looking to protect the entire watershed of the Great Bear Lake rainforest. If that were to be true and to come to be, that area alone, just that one protected area, would conserve the equivalent of over 24 years of Canada's national emissions in carbon. So what we're talking about is significant contributions, and what we're asking for is support of that leadership.
Thanks, Valerie. KM?
Yeah, so in the Philippines, we have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So it is enshrined in law. The free and prior informed consent is a key part of engaging with any Indigenous communities on their lands or in any projects or programs that affect them. So we are very fortunate to have that space already. And we are working on also passing ICCA law, so Indigenous and community conserved areas, through the Senate, which will also strengthen certainly our work at Center for Sustainability PH. We are very much committed to protecting areas in ways that certainly respect Indigenous peoples and local communities, and this is a great platform to be able to do that. So yeah, having that policy in place is critical, and having that national and international recognition kind of bearing down also is extremely important. So
it is important to note that there are many countries that do not respect Indigenous rights, and the world has a lot to do. We see frontline defenders killed in places throughout the world. And so while these are some good examples of progress in recent years, there are many countries that have a lot to do. And so for this framework to be successful, not only do we need these global targets, but we need countries to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, to increase land titling, to increase their sovereignty, and to fund resources for their conservation efforts. So this is an area where this framework, we hope, can advance that and make these targets global. But we also need to make sure that countries that have not respected Indigenous rights are held to standards to do that. Next question.
Yeah, but how exactly should that framework look like in order to actually protect Indigenous people's rights in those places that you mentioned? How would that look like to be?
Sure. So the first thing we think that's really important is that in Target 3, actually throughout the framework, in addition, there needs to be free, prior, and informed consent. So that means that before actions are taken that would impact lands that are stewarded, claimed by Indigenous peoples, they have a say over whether or not what actions take place there, that their traditional knowledge is incorporated into the actions that go forward for conservation. We know that the Convention on Biological Diversity on a whole, though, is subject to national laws. So the entire framework, whether it's on protected areas, on pollution, on invasive species, requires government leaderships and respects the sovereignty of governments. So we're beholden to them to make changes. So the Convention on Biological Diversity can and should make the strongest safeguards possible, but ultimately we also need to make sure that every country in the world has strong protections for indigenous peoples. It can't, the Convention on Biological Diversity alone can't ensure that. It has to happen throughout the world in individual legislation as well.
Sure, I'll go.
Sure.
Emma Farge from Reuters. I had a question about the 30 by 30 target itself. In your introduction to this press briefing, you mentioned that 88 governments were on board. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but if my maths is correct, that's about half of the delegations here. So which ones aren't on board? Where do you have to work the hardest to bring them on board? How will you do it? And also, when we talk about this target, do you think that there's a common understanding of what it means? Is it 30% globally, or 30% in each country, or both, land, sea, or both? If you could talk me through that, that would be really helpful.
Sure. I'll start with the support. The High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which is for those of you following online, it's HAC for natureandpeople.org is the website, and you can see on there's a list of the country supporters. It lists, I believe as of today, I believe we're at 90 countries are members of that High Ambition Coalition. That's a coalition of governments that have formally joined the coalition to advocate for the 30 by 30 target. There's additional countries that have endorsed the target outside of the High Ambition Coalition. Some have endorsed it just for the marine side. Others have said they support it, but haven't formally joined that coalition. So in my guess, if you look at the countries that are on the record in one form or another, it's over 100 countries now that have endorsed this. So the majority of the negotiators here. We haven't seen actually that many countries who have come out outright against it. There have been some countries that have wanted to see some more information about it. In the last negotiations, I believe maybe one or two parties questioned the target and whether it should be there, but the support, in my mind, was overwhelming for this target. There was, in terms of what is included in the 30 by 30, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the co-chairs in their recent note to parties made clear that it's a global target. That means 30% of the world's oceans and 30% of the world's lands. Not every country can meet that target individually, and it isn't expected to. A country like Rwanda or the Netherlands that both have large populations but not huge land masses, can't be expected to safeguard 30% of their lands, but they can contribute some to it. Other countries should be doing more than that. We saw in the World Conservation Congress a call for protecting 80% of the Amazon in order to maintain its ecological function. So this will mean that some countries will do more. Valerie can talk in Canada, and I think she would be a strong advocate that 30% is not enough of Canada to safeguard. But we know that globally we need to meet a minimum of that target to help reduce extinctions. Each country, if this target is agreed to, will develop a national biodiversity strategy. In that strategy, after they do their consultations, have the free, prior, and informed consent and engagement with communities, they'll determine what is the appropriate level of marine and terrestrial and freshwater conservation that they will make to contribute to this. I don't know if other panelists want to add to that at all.
I can add a little bit, Brian.
Sure, go ahead, Walter.
Yeah, just briefly that global aspect is really important. It is the Convention of Biodiversity after all, and biodiversity is unevenly distributed across the globe, and for biodiversity conservation, we're in a very different setting than with regards to addressing greenhouse gases, for example, because there contributions from anywhere could help equally, but for achieving biodiversity outcomes, that's not the case. We need more action in some parts of the world than in others in order to prevent wholesale species extinctions going forward that ultimately then will impact the whole planet, the function of the whole planet. So it's great to see initiatives for particularly important ecosystems to be more ambitious. I think we need to be also very clear that we cannot expect in any way that that responsibility would need to be shouldered just by those local or regional stakeholders, but indeed, and I think the we have here a wonderful campaign presenting today, right? Because we are talking about financing and other engagement as well. It is a global challenge, and insofar that global dimension is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Other questions?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add,
Sure.
Brian, is just that, you know, yeah, I agree. Here in Canada, because we have the real benefit of having the largest intact forest in the world, I think we have a burden of responsibility as a country that needs to see us go beyond 30%. I mean, just to get, you know, a few of the stats, we have 20% of the world's freshwaters. We get, you know, 3 to 5 billion birds that are born every year. We have a quarter of the world's wetlands. These are essential ecosystems to achieving not only biodiversity conservation, but also climate change mitigation. And so, yeah, we need to see that. And on average, what we found here in Canada is when Indigenous peoples are holding the pen, that they'll protect about 2/3 of their landscapes. So much more ambitious in terms of conservation. That being said, we need to recognize that Indigenous peoples, particularly here in Canada, have a different standard of living than the average Canadian. We have a much lower standard of living, and so we do have a development need in our community. So the trick is to find a way of creating ways to support this conservation ambition while ensuring that our communities benefit from living in a G7 country, frankly.
Thank you, Valerie. Other questions? I don't know if we have any online.
I'm able to give a question online on behalf of Thompson and Reuters Foundation.
Sure.
Is that okay, Brian?
It is, yes, go ahead.
Yes, so this question comes from Megan Rowling. I want to ask why NGOs think that government donors will sign up to a $60 billion annual funding goal, given that they haven't delivered on climate finance promises, and whether it might not be better to try and source the money from the private sector as well as governments, given that business is showing rising interest in nature protection. And if rich governments don't sign up to a bigger funding goal, will nature-rich developing countries likely push back in the negotiations? Thank you.
Sure, really good question. You know, we have seen a failure of resources to be materialized from governments in the climate space. We cannot continue to let that happen in climate, and we can't continue to let it happen here. The life on this planet depends on us having ambition on our climate targets and our biodiversity targets. This is not a question of how much money we're going to be putting that will materialize. We will pay this amount of money either today, or we will pay substantially more later on in lost ecosystem services, in the lost services that nature provides in clean water, in clean air, in pollination, all these things that we take for granted. If we destroy the ecosystems that we rely on, the cost will be astronomical. And I think governments are starting to recognize that this is an investment rather than just a cost. In terms of the private sector, frankly, the private sector has put very little money into nature conservation, especially protected, conserved, and restoration area. When you look at the real numbers, it's a pittance. The only way we can see that private sector money come is if governments require them to do that through increased regulations or other ways to do it. We've seen some countries, Costa Rica, for instance, when it started putting a price on carbon and tax, we started to see their protected area benefits and the money for their conservation was funded through that. So you can have the private sector do it, but they won't do it through the goodness of their heart. We've had decades for the private sector's goodness of their heart to fund nature conservation, and frankly, it hasn't shown up. So this is going to take governments either putting up money directly or putting in new regulations and new policies to make sure this money materializes. It must be done if we're going to have a future for the life on this planet, for future generations and for all species. We have to come up with this money. So it's not a matter of whether we hope it will, it has to happen now, or the cost will be astronomical for our kids and our grandkids. And I'll turn it over to KM or others who could add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that's also the reason why the High Ambition Coalition is so important. It's this public signal that we are prioritizing biodiversity, we are prioritizing 30 by 30, and this signals not just to other philanthropists and the corporate sector, but also for citizens like myself, voters from highly biodiverse countries, that can hold our governments to account for these kinds of commitments. So the High Ambition Coalition has a lot of value for that platform also.
Also important to keep in mind that this is a 2030 proposal, so these targets will ramp up. If these targets are agreed to, it takes a little while to implement them. So do we have an expectation that people will come and put $60 billion on the table in money during these negotiations? Unlikely, but will they commit to a pathway to get there? That's important. You know, during this course of this, we need a plan to materialize that finance. It can come directly from governments putting that money forward, or it can come from them radically changing policies and transforming the way they do finance and making sure that the businesses that are causing biodiversity loss, the oil and gas companies, the agriculture companies, the industrial fishing companies that are depleting nature on this planet are starting to pay for the damage that they're doing.
I'd be happy to add, Brian.
Yes, go ahead, Walter.
Just very briefly, because it's a comment that's cross-cutting, and addresses this question as well as the previous questions. There is one thing that's really very, very different to 12, 15 years ago when the Aichi targets were discussed, and that's what is something that makes me quite optimistic that we can ultimately fundraise for this, and we will fundraise for this, that it's possible, that this ambitious target is really needed now, and it's possible to implement it in a way that is inclusive. And that big difference is, from my corner, from the science corner, that we have very, very different actually information and abilities to transparently bring that information to the table as these decisions are ultimately made over the coming years. And I think that will help to get industry involved, and it will help a more inclusive way forward that brings local and regional communities along. So we are able now to very specifically map out the potential biodiversity outcomes, so how indeed a particular protected area, a particular activity will translate into biodiversity outcomes, and we are able to put that together with some forecasting. So it's not anymore nature conservation that sort of happens in some back rooms or in a non-transparent way in terms of what that actually comes out of it. But very differently to 10, 15 years ago, we have now spatial analytics, mapping in high detail, and a way to democratize that information broadly so that anybody, any stakeholder can get engaged and chime in, and so this can happen. And we've certainly seen industry engaging in different ways now than before, partly because of that technology aspect that they kind of like and are familiar with, and I feel that could help in some of the financing going forward. So there is something different in the science arena that I think is helping now in a much more powerful way than 10, 12 years ago.
Thank you, Walter. Any other questions online? Yes.
I actually have a follow-up question to you, Walter. Do we have the indicators that are good enough for us to, or do we have the right metrics in order to follow up on biodiversity loss, and in order to make it, to translate it into the political realm?
Yeah, so that's another big difference to the 2020 targets, that for this post-2020 framework, now there is this monitoring framework that's part of it, and where there are specific indicators and metrics thought about and decided on alongside the target language. And that was a real problem, and for many people, including me, I think one of the reasons for the mostly failures of the 2020 target was that the targets were kind of disconnected to the ways of measuring progress and actually being able to, well, maybe point fingers, but to really like look at each other, compare each other, how we're doing in this, right? Now in the new framework that is currently being finalized, there are indicators alongside every target of every goal. So there are now, for example, in Olay, very quantitative metrics that.
Oh no, what's happening?
We may have had.
My power just died. Yeah, something happened.
That sound is.
But we can. That's a bad sound.
Yeah, I know it well.
I think we're done, but we can connect you with Walter if you'd like to do a follow-up interview. Would you like to close?
Yes.
We're still on this.
Any last questions in the room?
Can I just say one last thing, actually, just from what Walter was saying about 2020 and now 2030? There is a whole new conversation that wasn't happening at a very popular level, and that's around IPLCs. There's finally identification and recognition of their contributions, and there's also now real talk about actually putting money there. And that, I think, is a huge sign of hope that we've never had before. As a frontline conservationist who's been working with Indigenous communities for so long, I've never had these conversations just openly in this kind of way. And so I do think that this is something that is going to give transparency in a way that we've never had before, and that I think that because of social media and just, I mean, we are more democratized, and in some ways we also aren't. But I do think that there's a lot more open discussion about the contribution of IPLCs and how to make that more meaningful on the ground. The funding mechanism conversations that we're having in these negotiations right now are how do we make that happen? How do we ensure that frontline organizations do get the funding that they need? Because the data shows that we are overwhelmingly more effective than any other. So it really is a time for hope, I do believe, in a way that we've never had before, especially from a rights-based perspective, really recognizing frontline communities that have been doing it since time immemorial, have embodied this transformative change since time immemorial, and finally we're getting that recognition.
Thank you, KM. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. For those of you watching online, if you need more information or want to get in touch with any of the speakers, you can find that information on our webpage, which is campaignfornature.org, campaignfornature.org. And I want to thank Cam and Valerie and Walter for participating, and for all of you for attending today and hearing about these priorities. Thanks so much.
Thank you.